Chapter 3 High School Hi-Jinks. My high school years started out with me looking forward to a new start in a new school. I only had a couple of friends at the time and was at best a decent student with above average grades. I mostly kept to myself and had developed a small reputation as someone who was good at writing in English classes. This was both good and bad. Good in that I got high marks in those classes, but bad in that the school bullies would sometimes force me to do their writing homework for them. I didn't like that at all, but it did give me an incentive to change how I was perceived. I guess I just didn't have the nerve to stand up for myself in those days. I was not a fighter, but I didn't want to have people looking at me like a doormat. Sometimes, though, you get lucky when things just come to a head, and suddenly everything changes. That time came in the middle of 10th grade English class. The school bully named Jimmy Benson, JB for short, asked me if he could borrow some blank paper from me to write some class notes. I was just about to tear an empty page out of my notebook when he grabbed my entire notebook and tore my notes right out of it, keeping them for himself, and then threw the book back at me. I looked at my ripped pages and something just snapped in me. I'm not sure where I got the strength to do what happened next, but I stood up in the middle of the class and, looking directly at him, said in as forceful a voice as I could muster, "After school, Jimmy." Now, you have to understand that in the jargon of high school culture, saying "after school" meant that you were challenging that person to a fight. Everyone in the class looked at me and, as one voice said, "Whoa." This certainly did not bode well for me, as JB was known throughout the school as one of the best fighters, and it was usually a bad idea to challenge him to anything, much less a fight. But there it was. I had sealed my fate with my outburst, and now I had to sit through 3 more classes. Way too much time for me to think about what I had gotten myself into. Of course, I couldn't back out, and I just decided to do the best I could and stand up to him. By this time, word had spread that I had challenged JB to a fight after school, and a whole bunch of students were planning on going, probably just to see me get hung out to dry. Finally, the dismissal bell rang, and I made my way out to the designated area behind the school, where differences were settled with your fists. About 30 students formed a large circle, and JB and I stepped into it. I wasn't sure how to fight, except for one I had seen on TV, and maybe what my parents sometimes did to each other. JB and I circled each other for about 10 seconds or so, and then he came at me like a tiger pouncing. I stepped to the side and he just struck a glancing blow to my chest. He seemed surprised that I could move that fast, and he came at me again. This time I held my ground and started trading punches with him. The crowd of students were all shouting for him to finish me off, and I realized that they were all there for him. No one was there for me. That realization, rather than depress me, seemed to spur me on. I think I got a shot of adrenaline because I suddenly became possessed, going at him with a savage flurry of punches that must have caught him off guard. I don't think he was expecting me to have that kind of energy, or even punching power, as a lot of my punches were landing and starting to have an effect on him. He regrouped and came at me again. I blocked a couple of his punches, but one caught me square in the chest and almost knocked me down. But I caught my breath and, circling again, I charged at him and caught him with a right across to his left shoulder. That must have hurt him, because he suddenly stopped and looked at me. I looked at him, not knowing what his next move was going to be. And then, to my surprise, he extended his hand and said, "You're pretty good. Better than I thought." "Thanks," I said. And we shook hands. We both walked out from the circle, and the group of students cheering him on weren't quite sure what to make of what just happened. They were there to see me get pulverized like a lamb being led to slaughter. But now, JB and I were walking out like we were best friends. I smiled, knowing that I had just survived one of those tests that sometimes defines who you are and helps you move forward. The fact that I had stood up for myself and somehow was still alive was monumental to me. Word quickly spread about the fight, and from that day on, no one in school bothered me again. Now that I was more accepted into the cool kids circle, I felt like I was part of something special. The other kids knew me as a pretty smart guy who didn't mind challenges. We always talked about what we could do to help each other out to make the drudgery of school a bit more bearable. I decided to embark on a business plan that would benefit any student in need, and this venture would eventually become known as the textbook store. Every student who took a class requiring a textbook would have to sign out that textbook at the beginning of the school year and be responsible for returning it at the end of the year. Failure to do so would result in a student having to pay for that textbook, and they were not cheap. Now, most students didn't lose their textbooks, but there were always some that did, and that's where I came in. I decided I would be a middleman, so to speak, who would provide textbooks to anyone in need for a nominal price. I had figured out how I was going to do this. I noticed there were several empty lockers spread throughout the school. I wrote down all of those locker numbers and went down to the custodian's office where, through some clever misdirection, I was able to look at the master book of locker combinations and write down all of the combinations to the empty lockers. Step 1 was now complete. The next step was going to be a bit trickier. I scoped out which empty lockers were near which classrooms and decided on how to arrange what books I would be borrowing from what classrooms to fill those lockers. The plan was to have each empty locker filled with different textbooks, one with math, one with history, one with science, etc. I noticed that some classrooms had extra textbooks sitting on shelves, and I would just have to go into those classrooms and walk out with the books and deposit them in the appropriate locker. This was kind of risky, though, since the teacher was usually around, and there'd be students who might catch me doing this, so I had to be pretty careful. I got to be pretty good at figuring out the exact window of time which would allow me to do this undetected. So in about 2 weeks' time, my lockers were full and I was open for business. Soon word got around that if you were missing a textbook, you'd make arrangements to see me, and I'd get it for you at a very reduced price. I usually charged $3 to $5, which wasn't much, but I figured I was helping these students out, and I didn't want to make it hard on them. If a student came up with a request for a book that I didn't have yet, I'd charge a bit more if it took me into some dangerous situations to procure. My system was working well, and the students were thanking me for helping them out. I really felt like I was an important part of our high school life and culture. Now that I was known as a pretty cool guy, I could be trusted with other types of clandestine operations. One guy that I knew named Mark, who lived on our block, had concocted a plan to get the attention of the entire school. It was all part of a larger plan to hold the school hostage while having a list of demands met. In retrospect, these demands were pretty silly, but at the time they sounded important. There were such things as better food for lunch, less detentions, more say in student government, less stringent dress codes, etc. The first salvo in this battle happened when a group of guys from the wrestling and football team stole the school mascot lion, a very heavy stone cement sculpture that was sitting on a pedestal in the lobby. I marveled how they got it out of the school. These guys actually picked it up off the pedestal. It must have weighed 500 pounds. Put it on a dolly, and rolled it out to a waiting van, where they drove it off to an undisclosed location. In its place on the pedestal was the ransom note. It said that the lion would be returned at the annual donkey basketball game if the demands listed in the ransom note were met. Of course, this became the talk of the school for the next few days. Step 2 was then put into action. It was time for Mark and I to go to work. Mark was a real whiz with all things mechanical and did some really fine work in the metal shop. He had made copies of the special key the custodians used to turn the lights on and off in the hallways. These keys looked a bit like little forks and were inserted into small slots into the wall plates. This was the first part of the plan. A bunch of us, who were all fully vetted to keep the secret, were given a special key and stationed around the school at each of these little light switches. At exactly 10 minutes to 8, just before homeroom, all of the lights would be switched off. It was then that Mark and I would go to work. Mark was equipped with a small screwdriver and I with a shopping bag. We would go to a classroom door. Mark would go to the inside of the door, and I would be on the outside of the door. Mark would unscrew the screw holding the doorknob to the door, and I would pull my end, and he would pull his end, and then we'd drop both knobs into the bag and move on to the next classroom. We had a pretty good system down, and we could get a doorknob off of a door in about 10 seconds. We cleaned out an entire section of the second floor when we began to see custodians running around switching all the lights back on. Mark and I decided we needed to quit before we were found out. I had already scoped out an empty locker I could stash the doorknobs in and quickly went there to hide them. I then went to my homeroom as if nothing had happened. Meanwhile, the entire school was having a nervous breakdown. Unbeknownst to us, a number of teachers had unwittingly shut their doors, and once shut, there was no way to open them without a doorknob. So that meant everyone in the classroom was locked in, with no way out. Word quickly spread that there was a growing emergency brewing, since students and teachers could not get to their classes. I certainly didn't intend for this to happen, but it only got worse. Students were forcing open the second-story windows and trying to jump out. The fire department was eventually called, and the big hook and ladder trucks were used to get students out of the second-story classrooms. It took nearly all day. As this was going on, the custodians and maintenance workers were all trying to figure out how to open the doors. They finally realized they'd have to actually take each door off of its hinges. This was a very time-consuming project, and they were understandably pissed off. An investigation was started to find out who was behind the burglary of nearly 40 doorknobs. The police were called in to aid the investigation, and I began to feel like it would be only a matter of time before I was found out. However, I was given assurances by anyone who knew about this that we were all going to keep our mouths shut. I kept a low profile during this time, not wanting to draw any attention to myself. I purposefully did not take any textbook orders for the entire week. Then, one day, out of the blue, one of my friends told me he had heard the head custodian had gotten wind of my empty locker scheme and he was going to raid them that morning. I realized that this could spell disaster for me. It was about 7:45, 15 minutes before homeroom. I quickly sprang into action and raced to each locker, opening them and grabbing as many books as I could, running to the classrooms and dumping them back onto the shelves as fast as I could. I had about 6 lockers to empty, and miraculously I was able to get all of them emptied out by the homeroom bell. I was pretty proud of my effort and thought that I had dodged a major bullet. Sure enough, that very morning, the custodians went to each of the lockers that had previously been filled with textbooks for sale, only to find them empty, devoid of any questionable activity. I breathed a sigh of relief and went to my classes for the day. I was sitting in my American history class, 6th period, when there was a knock on the door and Mr. Pappas, the head discipline officer of the school, stuck his head in and shouted, "Is there a Michael Ritchie in here?" All eyes turned towards me. The teacher answered, "Yes, he's sitting right there. Can I ask what this is all about?" Mr. Pappas just looked right at me and, without saying a word, banged his hand on the classroom doorknob. I knew then that the jig was up. His eyes glaring, he ordered me to get up and go with him. Great. I wondered how they found out. Someone must have spoken, ratted me out, weakened under pressure. We got down to the principal's office where there were several policemen, the principal, an assistant principal, Mr. Pappas, and myself. The interrogation started, and it soon became clear that I was being threatened with jail time, charged with endangering the lives of students and teachers. Apparently, some had attempted to jump out of the second-story windows, and those that remained were literally trapped in the rooms. I had no idea that would happen. The doorknob burglary was just an innocent prank that had somehow mushroomed into something much bigger. The police kept asking me who else was involved, since some students had seen me with someone else taking off the doorknobs. Now, I had been sworn to secrecy, and I didn't want to give up Mark's name, and I hemmed and hawed for a while. Finally, Mr. Pappas said, "We know it was Mark, so just come clean. It was him, wasn't it?" I told him that I wasn't sure, hoping to honor our commitment and keep our mouths shut. But then Mr. Pappas said, "We're calling your parents about this." Now it was getting serious. My parents weren't exactly easygoing when it came to punishment. I had suffered many a beating for much smaller mistakes, like talking back or failing to take out the garbage. This was major, and I realized I was really in it for now. I decided that I'd have to comply with Mr. Pappas's request, and I gave up Mark, which I reluctantly did. "There now, that wasn't so bad, was it?" he gloated, knowing he had achieved a small victory. If he could get me to break, he could probably get the rest of us to cave. Then he leaned in and told me he had already called my parents and they were on their way over to the school. Suddenly all the air went out of my body. I knew that whatever punishment Mr. Pappas had in store for me would pale in comparison to what my father would do to me. However, there was no escaping it. I just have to suck it up and bear it somehow. As it turned out, I got a terrible beating and got grounded for what seemed like a year. The police decided to waive any charges, considering I was a minor and had no previous record. Mr. Pappas, however, sentenced me and Mark to washing all of the walls of the school, which was an enormous job. Some of the walls had graffiti written on them, which made it really hard to get them clean, but we did our best. It took us about 3 weeks of after-school scrubbing to get all the walls cleaned. Meanwhile, the custodians had put in an emergency order for 40 new doorknobs to replace those that were taken. Even though I had to return the doorknobs Mark and I had removed, the new knobs were already paid for and on their way, so the school now had 40 extra doorknobs, which really ticked off the head custodian, and he let me know about it. He wanted me to pay for all the new ones, but I said that since I returned all the original ones, I didn't really owe the school anything. I guess I was a cheeky lad. Dumb, but cheeky. As time went on, the great doorknob caper became part of the folklore of the school. It was all people could talk about for weeks afterwards. However, there was an equally big event scheduled to happen as well, the return of the lion. When the day of the big donkey basketball game finally came, the promise of the lion's return was on everybody's mind. The ransom note was met with middling success. The administration decided to meet with student leaders to discuss some possible changes, but that was about it. I'm not sure anything ever solid ever came of it. I think the administration was just looking to appease the students to get the lion back. So here we were at halftime of the game. The floor cleaners were out with their brooms and buckets and shovels, since donkeys have a habit of crapping whenever they feel like it, and it needs to be picked up or the gym floor becomes really slippery with the smell of manure wafting through the air. One of our group had gotten hold of the PA system mic and made an announcement that the lion would be making an entrance, and then suddenly, as if by magic, the lion appeared, rolling in on a dolly that had been decorated with ribbons and garland and fancy material just for the occasion. The crowd jumped to its feet and cheered as if the lion was some conquering hero that had vanquished an unbeatable foe, which I guess in some way it had. After the game, the lion was returned to its rightful place on its pedestal in the school lobby, and everything eventually returned to normal. But all these years later, I can't help but think that despite all the crap I put up with and the doubts I had about myself, I really began to find out who I was and how I was going to make my way in the world. And it all started with me standing up and saying, "After school."